Okay, so we're up to the beginning of the second chapter. Just to summarize quickly what we did last week. Last week, the first page, Rabbi Shneir Zalman introduces the concept of the definitions of the conventional way of understanding the categories within human behavior. And we have the categories of righteous on one extreme, we have wicked on the other extreme, and then you have the Beinoni, which is Hebrew for intermediary. And the conventional interpretation is, and in some ways that's true. In other words, if you use it in some contexts, that's the way the Talmud uses it. If a person has majority of good deeds, they're righteous. If a person has majority bad deeds, they're wicked. If a person is just about half, 50-50, then they are intermediate. And that is the conventional way. And a lot of people like that because by that definition, I think I'm a tzaddik, I think I'm righteous. I may have some sins, but I guess I have majority good deeds. And those definitions are very action-based. It depends on what I do. So Rabbi Shneir Zalman says, if you look a little deeper, you will see that analysis does not stand up to scrutiny. How so? Because if you look at other sources in the Talmud, you will see that if a person does one sin, even a minor sin, even a violation of a rabbinic law, they are at that point wicked. And if a person repents, at that point they're righteous. So in other words, it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm doing. It has to, so if so, what is the intermediary position? What is the intermediary position? If I do even one sin, I'm wicked. If I repent, I'm righteous. What's the intermediary position? So it must be that these terms are not action-based. It's much deeper than the action. It reflects what's going on within my soul. And we had other Talmudic sources because we have one of the Talmudic sages, Rabbah, who's one of the greatest sages, never stopped studying Torah, certainly did not suspect himself of having 50% sins. And he says, someone like me is a Beinoni, is intermediary. So that tells us that there's a deeper definition here that we have to get to. So to introduce the deeper definition, we introduce the concept of the two souls. And that's based on the earlier Kabbalists, specifically the Eitz Chaim, who's Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was the student of the Arizal, who wrote to his teachers. He wrote down his teacher's teachings. So there it says every person has two souls, and it begins with the animal, and the animal soul is the natural soul. Now, natural soul's job is to preserve the self, is to focus on self, to increase its own comfort and pleasure, and survival, comfort, and pleasure. That's the natural soul. The natural soul of most people also has some goodness. How do we define goodness? The natural soul of most people also wants to do good for its altruistic purpose to help somebody else. But that would be the goodness in the natural soul. I'm saying to help somebody else, to differentiate that from what the Talmud says, that there is a category of kindness that isn't really kind at all. In other words, it's kindness in its effect, but it doesn't emerge from goodness. And that is if I'm helping somebody else for my own benefit, to make myself feel good, or for my own ego. It's a wonderful thing because the person receiving the help is being helped. But if you want to say, is it an expression of internal kindness? It's kindness, but it's not good kindness. Good, definition of good in this context, is transcendence, going beyond myself, putting the other person first. And most animal souls also have some good within them. But all that is the natural soul. And the natural soul, again, what does it want to do? Like everything else in nature, it wants to exist, it wants to thrive, it wants to have pleasure, and wants to have comfort. But that's a creation. Nothing in the natural soul would lead it to want to connect to the Creator, to escape itself and submit to the Creator. There's no connection there. What do I want? I'm focused on self. I want it to be good for me. That is the natural soul. And now in chapter 2, we introduce the second soul. And the second soul is what we're going to call a part of God. So we call it the godly soul, but it's a part of God. And in the first few lines, he introduces the godly soul. And once after he does that, the end of the chapter, he deals with other sources that just to clarify what we mean and how exactly it works. But it also a very important theme in chapter 2. He also talks about the concept of how come in Judaism, there's a notion of connecting spiritually to a righteous person, to a Torah sage, and that relates to the concept of about the godly soul. So within the Hasidic movement, not only Chabad, but the Hasidic movement in general, one of the principles of Hasidic life was to connect to a tzaddik, to connect to a righteous person. And we're going to get some insight into that in chapter 2. So that is the summary of chapter 1 and introduction to chapter 2. And so we'll begin. I'm going to put down first, I'm going to explain his big idea here, and then we'll read it inside, the first part of the chapter, and then we'll see if we continue. Hopefully we'll have enough time to do most of the chapter or the entire chapter. As always, comments and questions are always welcome. Please jump in. Okay, what's the second soul? Second soul is a part of God. How do you know that there is a second soul? And how do you know that a human being has a part of God within himself? And how does that different from what the Kabbalists say elsewhere? It's not written in the first book section of Tanya, but it's written in the second section of Tanya, that every creation has a soul. Every creation has a spark of God. So how is the human soul different than any other creation? So what Rabbi Shneur Zalman does, he says, if you look at creation, the story of creation in Genesis, you will see that the metaphor employed for the creation of the human being is different than the metaphor employed for all the rest of creation. When it comes to the rest of creation, what does the verse say? The verse says, Vayomer Hashem, God said, let there be light. God said, let there be a firmament. God said, let the earth give forth vegetation, etc. It uses the metaphor, employs the metaphor of speech. By contrast, when it talks about the human soul, what does it say? It says God blew in his nostrils a breath of life. So all of a sudden, it's not speaking, it's blowing. So something between the metaphor of speech and blowing will tell us the difference between the human soul, the godly soul, and the natural soul, and the godly soul and the rest of creation. Another source, another metaphor is going to be what it is written in the Zohar, that says that Zohar comments on the idea that all of creation stems from God's speech. But as we will see, based on the verse, he says, yes, but the godly soul stems not from speech, but from thought. God's thought, not God's speech, but God's thought. So these are the sources in scripture that indicate that there's something deeper to the human soul, to the godly soul. And we are now going to try to figure out what that would mean and what the metaphor tells us. So we'll start with the first metaphor. The first metaphor is that you have speech and you have blowing. Now, when a person, what's the difference between speaking and blowing? The difference is they both come from the breath of the person. You need ear, you need ear to be able to speak. When you speak, you're omitting ear. You also need, of course, ear to blow. But the difference is that some people could talk all day. You can talk, it doesn't take that much effort. It doesn't take that much effort for the person, and therefore people could speak for a relatively long period of time without getting tired, especially some people love to talk. When it comes to blowing, however, blowing comes from a much deeper part within the self. And that's why if you blow, you notice that you're going to get tired very quickly. You have to blow up a balloon. One balloon, two balloons, if you're in good shape, is good. If not, it will be too difficult. So what do we see? What do we see from here? We see that even though God creates everything, but all other creations are created from a more external level of God. The godly soul comes from a deeper space within God, which is much more internal. And that's why the metaphor of breath is used. So that's the first point. Now we have another point. The verse says that B'ni B'chori Israel is my firstborn son. So you have the metaphor of the son. And based on that verse, I'm pretty sure it's based on that verse, the Zohar says that the Jewish soul, the human soul, comes not from speech, but from the thought. As we'll see later, I'll use that metaphor of the child coming from the parent's brain. We'll get to that later. But the bottom line is, let's think about the difference between speech and thought. What is the difference between speech and thought? The difference between speech and thought is that speech is, the function of speech is to communicate to somebody else. Whereas the function of thought is for myself. I think for myself. I could think about an idea and not share it. But speech is really designed as a means of communication to somebody else. So what does that mean in our context? In our context is, if you're going to use a metaphor that God spoke means God communicates to somebody else. Somebody else in this context means the creation. But when I'm talking to somebody else, I'm giving great significance to the other person. In other words, when you say speech, you means also, you're also even physically, when I speak, the words emerge from me and go out into the environment, and the other person can take them any way they want. So speech represents the idea of I'm speaking to somebody else, and the energy that is exerting from myself sort of leaves my domain and becomes its own thing. So therefore, and that's the status of all of creation. All of creation, although it's dependent on God, although it's created by God, but in its own feeling, in its own consciousness, it is separate. Why? Because God spoke to it, but it now is a separate person, a separate entity. If we say the human soul emerges from and is in God's mind means you're still within God. In other words, in the consciousness of the human soul, which is different than the consciousness of the soul of every other creation, meaning all the other objects and the vegetation and the inanimate objects. When you're talking about the soul is within God's mind. Within God's mind, you feel not your own existence, you feel the presence of God. So the soul doesn't have its own identity. Its identity is it's part of God, and it retains the consciousness of godliness. And therefore, as you will see later, not expressed exactly here in this chapter, but as you will see later, all the soul wants is to reconnect back to its source, because in its consciousness, it feels its source and it wants to connect to its source. As opposed to all other creations, even though they have a divine source, they don't feel connected to the divine source. Go ahead, Bob, please.
So when the bedrock of our religion is the Shema. Shema means to listen. Listen implies speech. Speech implies community, minyan, connectiveness. So are we to assume then when we listen, which seems to be the commandment du jour, are we appealing to the animal soul as opposed to our godly soul?
So that's very interesting. We are appealing to the godly soul, and therefore it says Yisrael. Yisrael is usually the godly soul. The reason why we use speech, because even the godly soul, the way it's in the human consciousness, we're not always paying attention to it. In other words, as we will see later, the conflict here is that we have both the voice of the godly soul and the voice of the animal soul, and we're telling ourselves we need to listen because the conscious mind needs to listen to, in a sense, to the call of the godly soul. So when we say listen, hear, O Israel, listen, Israel, we could also mean listen to our Israel, listen to the voice of Israel within ourselves. So the short answer is, even the godly soul, as it enters the body, it still needs to, we still have to pay attention to it. In other words, it's not that once we have it, we don't have to do any work. We have to do work, listen in, to communicate with that part of ourself, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It's just that I always thought that when we covered our eyes, we were trying to block our sight and more acutely listen with our ears. So, I never saw the jump to listening to our thoughts.
Right.
But anyway,
yes.
I'll buy it.
No. So let's analyze this for a second. We have to close our eyes because our eyes give us the input and give us the input of the physical world. And the physical world is the realm of speech. So we have to close our eyes because what we want to connect to is something that is intangible. So that's why we close our eyes. And when we close our eyes, what faculty do we have? So we have the faculty of shma, listening. Now, listening in Hebrew has a double meaning, because in English, you would say listen to mean to listen to words. But in Hebrew, listen could also mean understanding. Also in Yiddish, if I'll tell you something and I say, do you hear me? In English, I'm just asking I'm asking the person if their audible skills work or if their hearing aid works. But in Yiddish or Hebrew, I say, shomea, do you hear me? And do I hear me means, do you comprehend? Do you understand? And in Hebrew, the reason why you have the word listening to mean both word and understanding is because in some sense they have a similarity, because the word that you use, the word is less tangible than the object of sight. If I see something, I'm looking at something tangible. If I hear something, I'm listening to a voice which is intangible. So in that sense, that's why in the Hebrew, listening to words and understanding are both used the same word, because you're employing the skill that is less tangible. So when I close my eyes, I say, I'm not looking at what is tangible. I'm looking at the intangible, and then I'm going to understand what my soul understands, what my godly soul understands, because that's really your question. Your question is, are we talking to the godly soul or the animal soul? Then I'm going to get to what my godly soul understands. What does my godly soul understand? Hashem Echad. There's nothing outside of Hashem. Why not? Because the godly soul is within God's mind. And in God's mind is, think about within your mind, all the phenomenon you know within your mind is really part of you. All other creations have the consciousness of God's speech. Speech is when you're speaking to someone outside of you, so it's separate. So when we're saying the Shema, we're covering our eyes and we're saying, let's listen. Let's listen to what? Let's listen to the perspective of the mind, of the soul. And the perspective of the soul, even though there's a universe and there's a world and there's a universe, but it's all one. Why is it all one? Because it's all within the consciousness of Hashem's thinking. And like I said, within yourself, everything you know, when it's still within yourself, it's still within you. Once you speak it, it's outside of you. So that's really the difference between the consciousness of the divine soul, the godly soul, and the rest of creation.
Bravo. It's like I was a good volleyball player. I set the spike up and you spiked it.
You know, you got, yeah, that's why we need the ball's got to go back and forth. Absolutely. Okay, so that's the first notion, and everything that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to do basically from here on is based on these two premises. In other words, you can't overestimate the importance of these two souls to everything that's going to follow, because they're not only two different drives, but they're opposite drives. And the animal soul, what it wants is self, and everything it's going to want is going to come back to self. And the divine soul, what it wants is really godliness. In other words, it feels itself as within God's mind. The true reality is godliness, and connecting to godliness is what it wants. Separating from godliness is painful. So it's not two souls and that happen to be a little bit different in their makeup and what they appreciate. One likes classical music and one likes, rock music. No, they're two souls that have completely opposite pulls and drives. And the place where they start is different, right? The purpose, what they feel is the purpose of their existence is different. So one way to put it is like this: the animal soul is the consciousness of the creation. Creation is mortal, so the animal soul feels threatened by its mortality. I know at some point I'm not going to exist. So subconsciously, what do I need to do? My whole existence is about ensuring my existence, because I have that insecurity. Why do I have that insecurity? Because I am mortal. And because I'm mortal, all day long, I'm trying to battle that mortality. And that's why I'm trying to help myself and survive and extend my being. When it comes to the godly soul, ironically, the godly soul is immortal because it's part of God. If it's part of God, it doesn't have to wake up in the morning and say, where am I in the picture? Doesn't deal with that. It doesn't have that drive. It doesn't have that need to assert itself. To the contrary, what does it want? It wants to go back to its source. So this is the foundation of everything that's going to follow. Now, within this, once we put that premise, the first third of the chapter, which we'll read inside now we have to deal with other problems. And the other problems we have to deal with is, it seems that within Jewish literature, it seems that there is differences between souls, and some souls are higher than other souls. And some people are better able to give their children higher souls, and some people are not as able to give their children higher souls. So now what's going to happen after the first third of the chapter, we have to explain the other sources within Jewish literature to understand that no, both are true. There are grades within souls, but yet all souls are a part of God. So that's what we're going to have to do. While we do that, Rabbi Shneur Zalman also explains once you get the doctrine of how these souls work, you'll figure out what the importance within Judaism is to connect to a sage and connect to what we would call a Rebbe, a spiritual leader. And then, but again, the main point I think is the first third, but then we have to deal with the other issues. So we that's why the chapter is a little bit, doesn't end after the first third. There's another 2 sections that follow. Okay, enough introduction. Now we could jump right in. Now also there is a comment here. I don't know if we want to get into it. There's a comment here. Maybe we'll skip it for now. We'll decide if we want to get back to it. It's a Kabbalistic idea. And years ago, we studied a discourse from Rabbi Shneur Zalman's grandson on this, and literally there were 11 chapters explaining this exact one comment. So it will derail us. So for now, we're going to skip it. We'll read. Maybe we can read. We'll read it, but there's a lot of Kabbalistic theological issues here. So I'm just going to read it, and then we'll deal with it at some point. Okay, I'm sharing the screen, which is chapter 2 of the lessons in Tanya. I think we're sticking to this version. I'm going to try to share it in the chat if that helps anybody. Paste. Not sure this helps anybody, but if you do, you could take it. You could read it at home, print it out, read it on Shabbos. Okay, the second uniquely Jewish soul is truly a part of God above. Part of God above. Chelek Elokam Yimal Mamash. Okay, how do we know this? As it is written concerning Adam, whose soul was a comprehensive one, a neshama klalit, in that it contained all the particular souls of subsequent generations. You know what? It's a long chapter today. Let's try to go back. I'm sorry for jumping around. Let's go back to just the regular translation without the commentary. I'll share that one as well. Chapter 2. Paste. Okay, you have both. I'm reading the second one over here. It's just shorter because there's less interspersed with other words. So we have to finish sometime. So I think we'll try this one. And then after this, we'll decide. Next week, we'll decide which one we like better. Here we go. The second soul of a Jew is truly part of God above, as it is written. And he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And thou didst breath in the soul into me. Okay, that's why you see it's arcane. And it is written in the Zohar, he who exhales from within him. That is to say, from the inwardness and the innermost. For it is something of his internal and innermost vitality that man emits through exhaling with force. In other words, like as we said earlier, it's not spelled out here, but we know when the verse says with the human soul, God blew into his nostrils a breath of life, we know that that's in great contrast to all other creation where it says God spoke. So the Zohar says when you're going to exhale, in other words, you're going to blow, not just speak, it's coming from the depth much deeper within yourself. So that is the metaphor. What is the analog? What do we take away from this? So allegorically speaking, have the souls of Jews risen in the divine thought, as it is written, my firstborn son is Israel, and ye are children unto the Lord your God. That is to say, just as a child is derived from his father's brain, so too, to use an anthropomorphism, the soul of each Israelite is derived from God's, blessed be he, thought and wisdom. For he is wise, but not through a knowable wisdom, because he and his wisdom are one. And as Maimonides says, we're going to skip the comment, that he and his knowledge, that he is the knowledge and knower, and this is not within the power of any man to comprehend clearly, as it is written, canst thou by searching find God? And it is also written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Okay, so this is the idea. The idea here is, he says, look, quotes the Zohar, there is a verse that says, B'ni B'chari Yisrael, Israel is my firstborn son. Says the Zohar, what does it mean, firstborn son? The child comes from the parent's brain. We'll see what that means. Child comes from the parent's brain. In other words, says the Zohar, of course, God doesn't have a physical brain, but it means the Jewish soul derives from God's thought. What does it mean it derives from God's thought? It means that, like I said, we are, the consciousness of the godly soul is still within God. So within God's thought, all you feel is godliness. Once the word is spoken, you already feel creation. Now, there's ideas here. He quotes Maimonides because this is a problem. To say God's thought is a little bit of a problem. And this is what I said, there's 11 chapters discussing this concept. How could you say God's thought? God is undefined. How could you say God has thought? So Maimonides discusses this, and Maimonides says God has knowledge, but it's not the knowledge that we know. God, because the way it is within ourselves, so excuse me for getting philosophical, Maimonides says the way it works within ourselves, Maimonides says the way it works within a human being, you have the knower, the person, you have the knowledge, the thing that's being known, and you have the capacity to know. So you have three distinct objects or three distinct entities. And with a human being, each of these are distinct. You cannot say that about God, because that would mean God is acquiring knowledge. It means he's composed of multiple things. He's got himself, he's got knowledge, and he's got what is known. So Maimonides says God is knowledgeable. God has knowledge, but it's not the knowledge that we know, because with God, the knower and the known and the capacity to know are all one. And Maimonides says nobody can understand it. You cannot understand it. It's totally different with God. Now, do we agree or we disagree? Maimonides says you can say God is wise, but not with the wisdom that we know. The note, Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, look, the Kabbalists disagree with Maimonides, but they agree with him about Atzilut. So in other words, they say the essence, Maimonides says that you can refer to the essence of God as wise, because God and his wisdom are one. Kabbalists say, no, you cannot refer to the essence of God as wise. However, the Kabbalists agree with Maimonides regarding the 10 sfirot of Atzilut, of the highest world. In other words, within the highest world of Atzilut, there is wisdom, and there God unites with the wisdom. This is very interesting, but it's not relevant to our point. All it's here to explain is when the Zohar says, God, Israel, emerged in God's thought, we're trying to explain what God's thought is. So I don't want to get too tied into this, but in any case, we'll read the note. And as the sages of the Kabbalah have agreed with him, it's funny because they really disagree. They disagree with Maimonides about the essence of God. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says they agree about the 10 sfirot of Atzilut. But that's already a separate point. As it is stated in the Pardes of Rabbi Moshe Cardaviro, also according to the Kabbalah of the art, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, this is substantiated in the mystical principle of clothing of the light of Ein Sof, blessed be he, through numerous contractions with the vessels Chabad, the world of Atzilut emanation, but no higher than that. For as explained elsewhere, the Ein Sof, blessed be he, is infinitely exalted over and transcends the essence and level of Chabad, which is intelligence, which in relation to him are regarded as material action, as it is written, thou hast made them all with wisdom. Without getting into details, again, what's happening here is Maimonides says God's wisdom is the essence of God, but make no mistake, God's wisdom is different than our wisdom. The Kabbalists agree that God's wisdom is different than our wisdom, but the Kabbalists say that only applies in the world of Atzilut. The world of Atzilut is after there's the tzimtzum, after the infinite light is contracted, and you only have a revelation of a ray of light. That light creates 10 faculties, including Chabad, including wisdom, and there God and his wisdom are one. Okay, but we don't want to get too far deep into this. If anybody wants to comment on this, wonderful. If not, we'll continue. The big picture is the Jewish soul emerges from God's thought. That's the takeaway. And because it emerges from God's thought, it doesn't sense creation as a separate entity, because it's not speech. Speech is when you speak outside of yourself, and the word emerges and connects to, and the words emerge outside of you. And there's an entity outside of you that you're talking to. But when the metaphor of thought, it's all within yourself. And therefore, the godly soul's consciousness it's part of the one God. It senses the oneness of God. It does not sense itself. It doesn't want itself. It doesn't want to preserve self. Later on, there's a beautiful metaphor in chapter 19. I'm only saying it because it's Hanukkah, and Hanukkah is all about light. And the metaphor they are given based on a verse of King Solomon, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam, the The candle of God is the soul of man. And there Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, you look at the candle. What does the candle want? Look at the fire. What does the fire want? Fire wants to escape the wick. And fire wants to escape the wick. And when it escapes the wick, what's going to happen? It's going to disappear. But it wants to escape its wick. That's why fire fire surges upward. It defies gravity. And it's as if to say the fire wants to escape the wick, even though if it escapes the wick, it's going to lose its identity. Why? Because it's a metaphor for something that wants to go back to its spiritual source, even though it's going to lose the identity that it has as a separate entity because it's submerged in something greater than self. So when you want to think about a physical image of the soul is the flame trying to escape the body because it wants to go up. When it goes up, it's going to lose its distinct identity, but that's exactly what it wants because it wants to go back to its source. It's more comfortable in its source. So if you need a physical demonstration to remind us of what the godly soul does and how the godly soul feels. And again, this is because the godly soul emerges deeper within God than all other creations. And that's the first metaphor, the metaphor of breath. And then taking that, explaining and expounding upon that, what does that really mean? It means that we come from a deeper place within God. So we come from a place where the consciousness is not of a separate entity, the way you would have it with speech, but it is a consciousness within that we come from the consciousness of the God's mind, where all of creation is still within himself. And therefore we sense that we're part of him and what we want, and he's the source of life. And what we want is to connect to God. So that's how we know, now we're done. We really can go home now, but we have a problem. We have a problem that we have to deal with the common notions about the human soul, which are all true. We're going to put it up. We're going to explain it by employing a metaphor. And this metaphor will also help us explain the centrality of the concept of a righteous person and connecting to a righteous person within the Hasidic movement, which is one of the most important principles within the Hasidic movement in general, and one that was under attack. Many people felt that it was not consistent with traditional Judaism, the level of connection that the Hasidim have to their master, to their teacher. Here we have a few lines that address that notion. But before we go to that, we have to deal with the problem. What is the problem? The problem is that how could you say all souls are part of God if we know that there's many different levels within souls? And he takes it as a premise. He says you cannot compare the souls of Moses and the patriarchs to the souls of our generations. Mystically speaking, all of the souls of all people throughout all times could be considered as part of one organism, sort of one body, so to speak. And the Talmud refers to the end of days, the generations before the coming of Mashiach, as the heels of Mashiach. So employing that metaphor, we understand that the souls of the patriarchs and the souls of Moshe are like the head, and our souls are like the feet. But later he'll say maybe the heels, literally the heels. The heels has obviously much less vitality than the brain. So we see that there's so many differences between souls. You can have the soul of the head and the soul of the feet, of the heel. And then he says even more. Then he's going to say that, look, he's going to say, even within every generation, there are people who are extremely spiritual, and their souls are like the heads of that generation. And then there are people who their souls are very, very, very not spiritual, very coarse, and they could be like the heels of that generation. So how are you telling me that everything comes from, every soul has a divine, every soul is part of God, and it comes from the Hashem's mind, if we see a vast spectrum of souls? That is the question. And what is the answer going to be? The answer is going to be, we're going to find a metaphor where both are true. There could be a spectrum within souls, even dramatic spectrum. Nevertheless, they all emerge from the same source, and they still have this, they're still made up of the same DNA, essentially the same DNA. And the metaphor he's going to use is a metaphor of childbirth. So you have a child which emerges from the seed of the father. In the seed of the father, that's the stuff that enables the child to be born. Then you have the child. Within the child, You have all different grades. You have the brain, you have the foot, he's going to say you even have the toenail. All of them, all parts of the child come from the father's seed equally. At his perspective, the way that Tanya puts it, the father's seed is part of the child's, part of the brain. The seed is part of the brain of the father. Now, even though biologically it's not that way, we know today, but it's connected in the sense that to be able to produce the seed, you need the awareness of the mind. Okay? So what's happening here is we have the metaphor of the child, and we see here is a metaphor for something that there's many different parts of the human of the child, and they're dramatically different between, you can't compare the brain to the toenail. Nevertheless, they all emerge from the same source. And not only that, after they are created, if you go down to the DNA level, he doesn't use that term, obviously, but you go down to the core, what are they? They're the seed of the father. And that's how you can have many different levels within the human soul, within the souls, from different generations, earlier generations to our generation, and even within our generation, souls that are much more spiritually sensitive than other souls. And one could be like a toenail, and one could be like the brain. Nevertheless, they are all emerged from the Father's mind equally. And that's how we're going to say every single soul is a part of God, within God's mind. Even though if what we see now, the child, I feel like a toenail. I feel like I don't have spiritual vitality. I don't have spiritual sensitivity. It doesn't matter. At the core, that's what my soul is. My soul is the seed of the Father. And that's the metaphor we're going to employ. Once we employ that metaphor, now we understand the idea of why I have to connect to a righteous person. So we'll get to that in a minute. So we'll read it. Okay, here we have a very long paragraph. You see, that's the benefit of reading the other book. It's all broken down. Maybe the other book was better. Okay, we'll see. By the time we finish chapter 53, we'll have an idea of which book we want to use. So that's good. And though there are myriads of different gradations of souls, nishamot, rank upon rank, ad infinitum, as with the superiority of the souls of the patriarchs and Moses, our teacher, above the souls of our generations who live in the period preceding the coming of the Mashiach, which are as the very soles of the feet compared with the brain and head. You see, in Hebrew, in English, he says, who live in the period preceding the coming of Mashiach. But in the Talmudic language, it's called ikvei de Mashiach, at the heels of the Messiah. So heels of the Messiah means it sounds like Messiah is coming. You could already hear his heels. You could hear his steps. But Kabbalistically, what it means is that our generations are the bottom of that organism of souls. So that's what he says, which are the very soles of the feet compared with the brain and head. So that's within all generations. Now we say, so it is, so in every generation. There are leaders of the Jews whose souls are in the category of head and brain in comparison with those of the masses and the ignorant. Likewise, are there distinctions between a fashot and a fashot? For every soul consists of nefesh, ruach, neshama. So in other words, you have various souls. Every soul has many levels, and there's basically infinite amount of different levels within souls. And no two souls are the same. So how could you say they're all part of God? They all come from God's mind. Look, there's so many gradations between the souls. You can be a very lofty soul. I can be a lower soul. You can be spiritually sensitive. I can be spiritually coarse. Even my godly soul I'm referring to. So how could it be that it all comes from Hashem's mind? Here we go. Nevertheless, the root of every nefesh, ruach and neshama, which are different names of souls, from the highest of all ranks to the lowest, that is embodied within the illiterate and the most worthless, all derive, as it were, from the supreme mind, which is Chachma Ilah, supernal wisdom. In other words, every soul, even if right now it looks coarse, it looks like it's disconnected, nevertheless, comes from Hashem's mind, Hashem's wisdom, the Kabbalistic term, Chachma Ilah, supernal wisdom. Now we have the metaphor. The manner of this descent is analogous to that of a son who is derived from his father's brain, in that even the nails of his feet come into existence from the very same drop of semen, by being in the mother's womb for 9 months, descending degree by degree, changing continually, until even the nails are formed from it. Yet, after all this process, it is still bound and united with a wonderful and essential unity with its original essence and being, which was the drop as it came from the father's brain. And even now, in the Son, the nails receive their nourishment and life from the brain that is in the head. As it is written in the Gemara Nida, from the white of the father's drop of semen are formed the veins, the bones, and the nails. And in Eitz Chaim Shara Chashmal, it is likewise stated, in connection with the esoteric principle of Adam's garments in the Garden of Eden, that the garments were the nails derived from the cognitive faculty of the brain. So again, the metaphor is not necessarily biologically perfect the way we understand it now. But again, we're getting to the same idea. The same idea is that everything comes from the seed. The seed ultimately comes from the father's brain. The seed, it changes within the mother's womb, and it creates a full body, which all different types of gradations. Nevertheless, they all are essentially the seed of the father. And even now, the seed of the father, which is brain. And even now, the toenail, how does the toenail get life? From the brain of the child, which is essentially the brain of the father. Okay, now what does this mean? What does this mean for us with the souls? So now he explains. So as it were, is it actually true of the root of every nefesh, ruach, and neshama, which is different souls, in the community of Israel on high, descending degree by degree through the descent of the worlds of Atzilut, emanation, Bria, creation, Yetzirah, formation, and Asiya, action from his blessed wisdom. As it is written, thou hast made them all with wisdom. In other words, there's an order of the worlds and the descent of the worlds. And when the souls descend, they each form, in other words, they descend through the worlds. Some of them are going to change, and some adapt the characteristics of the higher world, and some adapt the characteristics of the lower worlds. Just like the seed changes, and part of the seed becomes a brain, and part of the seed becomes a toenail. The nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the ignorant and unworthy come into being. Nevertheless, they remain bound and united with a wonderful and essential unity with their original essence and entity, namely the extension of Chachma Ilah, the supernal wisdom. Inasmuch as the nurture and life of the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the ignorant are drawn from the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the saints and sages, the head of Israel in every generation. Okay, we'll explain that. We have to get to the next paragraph, and then we'll explain the last 3 lines. So I'm just going to close this so I can see you a little bit. What are we saying here? We're saying here there is a verse in the Torah, which we're going to get to in a minute, that says, it's in Deuteronomy, after most of the commandments have been introduced, so you think we already know what we're supposed to do. So there's a new commandment. The commandment says, Uladafka bo, you should cleave to God, which is a very strange verse, because first of all, as the Talmud says, how can you cleave to God? God is a fire, meaning he's you get too close, you get burnt up. God is infinite. You can't. How do you cleave to God? Now, what are you going to tell me? You cleave to God through performing the mitzvot? Well, we already wrote about all the mitzvot. This commandment follows the mitzvot, right? So after doing all the mitzvot, that's not enough. You also have to cleave to God. But how do you cleave to God? That's what the Talmud says. Could a person connect to the divine presence? It's impossible. So here's what the Talmud answers, which seems like a strange answer. The Talmud says, the verse says you have to cleave to God, but you can't cleave to God. So you know what? Cleave, the Talmud says it means cleave to the Torah sages. Now, is that a good answer? It's almost like it's saying, well, you can't cleave to God, so the second best thing is to cleave to the sages. But that's not what the Torah says. The Torah doesn't say cleave to the sages. The Torah says cleave to God. So how could the Talmud say that means cleave to the sages? So that has to be, spiritually speaking, the way you cleave to God is you cleave to the sages. How so? Let's see what Rabbi Shneur Zalman says. This explains the comment of our sages on the verse, and to cleave onto him. It's a verse in Deuteronomy. What do the sages say? He who cleaves onto a scholar of the Torah is deemed by the Torah as if he had become attached to the very Shekhinah, the divine presence, right? The verse says you have to cleave to God. We say, how do you cleave to God? It's impossible. So the Talmud says, cleave to the scholar. And if you cleave to the scholar, it's like you cleave to God. How so? So here we go. Going back to the metaphor of the child and the parent. For through attachment to the scholars, the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the ignorant are bound up and united with their original essence and their root in the supernal wisdom. He and his wisdom being one, and he is the knowledge. So what's happening is like this. Going back to the metaphor. The metaphor is you have a toenail. I'm spiritually a toenail. I come from the stuff of the Father's brain, but I don't sense it in my consciousness. So how do I connect to my source, which is the Father's brain? The way I do that is connecting to my brain, right? I'm the child. The child's toenail connects to the child's brain, and now it's in touch with its true essence. What's its true essence? Its true essence is that it is really an extension of the father's brain. So in other words, what he's saying that for the soul to be able, even every soul is a part of God. Every soul emerges from a place of the divine wisdom, which in that space, the only awareness is the awareness of God himself. The problem is that I'm the toenail, I don't sense it. So I have to cleave to the people who sense it. And if I cleave to the people who sense it, ultimately, I will also sense it. Ultimately, they help me discover that I too, even though I don't feel it, my DNA, what is my substance? Where do I come from? I am part of the Father's brain. Because we're all essentially the same DNA. We all come from the seed of the Father. So that is sort of a big idea. Now we have three more lines, one more bracket. What about the problem? There are people who not only don't cleave to the sages, but go against the sages. How do they get life? How do they get sustenance? Rishner Zalman says that the sustenance of the toenail comes to the brain of the child. In the metaphor, the brain of the child is the Torah sage. So here we have another Kabbalistic concept, which is called from the back. So we'll talk about that in a second. Let's read it inside. As for them who willfully sin and rebel against the sages, the nurture of their nefesh, ruach, and neshama comes from behind the back, as it were, of the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the scholars. What does it mean behind the back? So in the Kabbalah, there's a metaphor of there's two types of giving flow. There's two types of ways to give. One is you give face to face, and one is when you turn your back and you give somebody behind your back. That would mean you turn your will away from the person. When I give you a gift and I want to give it to you, I give it to you face to face. When I give it to you because I have to give it to you and I don't want to give it to you, then I turn my back to you and I give it to you behind my back. And that's the metaphor that Kabbalah uses of how the forces of unholiness in this world get their sustenance, because everything comes from God. So why does God give sustenance to the people or the phenomenon that he doesn't like? And the answer is, he gives it to them, but he doesn't give them face to face. He gives it to them, so to speak, against his will. Against his will means he is not forced to do it, but God wants unholiness in the world, so there'll be balance, so there'll be free choice. So he has to have that phenomenon in the world, but still, that's not what he really wants. It's only a means to an end to be able to give people free choice. So God gives it to us behind the back. Behind the back means it gives it to the unholiness behind the back, meaning it's indirect and without a willful connection. So ultimately, every soul is going to get its life via the souls of the sages. Either they'll get it in a way straightforward, face to face, if not face to face, back to back. So why do we have these last two paragraphs? It's all to explain that even though you look around and you see different variations and gradations within souls, and you see some people that their godly soul is super sensitive and open to spirituality, and you have other people that even their godly soul, they don't really feel so connected to godliness. So how could the Rabbi Shneur Zalman start the Tanya and start the chapter and say, every single soul is a part of God, not only a part of God, but a part of God as it emerges from the inner dimension of God, from the divine wisdom. Within divine wisdom, there is no sense of anything being outside of God. So how could there be such a great variety within souls? The answer is all souls are made of the same DNA. They all come from the Father's seed. They all have the same essential core. But as they emerge within the body, some of them come and come like the brain of the child, which means it's more recognizable. Their source is more recognizable within them. And others, they're the toenail, spiritually speaking. But even the toenail, what is the toenail? Toenail is an extension of the Father. So it has that essential DNA, which is that all it wants is to connect to the Father. That is the metaphor, and that's a second third of the chapter. Then we have one more third that we have to deal with, which is another passage of the Zohar that seems to be a contradiction to what we were saying. So we have to put that to rest as well. But in the meantime, let's see if we can deal with a few questions. Go ahead, Vicky.
If we have time for that, but I just want to understand how can tzaddik or somebody can give the something to unholiness against his will. Does that person need to trick him or something?
No. Just like God, you don't trick God. In other words, what we're saying is that when the way you give, In other words, what was the question? The question was, people who rebel against the tzaddik, how do they get flow from the tzaddik? The premise of the question is that to receive, there has to be a face-to-face connection. There has to be a spiritual connection. I have to want to be connected to you to receive from you. And so we say no. And the Kabbalah explains that I could receive from you even if I'm not, if I have no face-to-face connection with you, even if I don't want a connection to you. If I don't want a connection to you means now the way I'm getting it is it's being thrown to me behind your back. In other words, there is a way to get something. The premise is to get something, I have to show up and face you and stick out my hand. The answer is no, I can get it even if I don't have that desirable connection, that connection through spiritual desire and spiritual will to connect. And that's what we say when we mean behind the back. So yes, you can receive spiritual nourishment from the soul of the righteous, even if you don't want to receive it.
Oh, so you don't want to receive it, but the righteous person or the God still wants to give it.
It goes both ways. If you don't want to get from me, then I don't want to give to you. But the point is, it doesn't happen through a direct face-to-face connection. Face-to-face connection means that there's a desire on both ways. If there's no desire on my part, there's no desire on your part, right? You don't want to have a relationship with a person who doesn't want to have a relationship with you. In other words, it's not a conscious thing. It's not like the tzaddik knows and says, oh, that guy offended me in shul, so I don't want to give him nourishment. It doesn't work that way. It's a spiritual flow and a spiritual connection. And what Rabbi Shneur Zalman says is that everybody, all souls are going to get their sustenance from their source souls, the heads of the the generation, so to speak, whether or not they know, whether or not they desirous of that relationship.
So it comes from all the pool of the flow that surrounds the tzaddik, whether he wants or not, or whether the recipient wants or not.
Right.
And the same with Hashem.
I'm sorry?
And the same with Hashem.
Yeah, so with Hashem, yeah. So we're just borrowing the term. The reason I brought in the discussion of how Hashem gives life to Klippa, we're just borrowing the term. Man deshadei batzu kasvoi is a term from the Medrash and the Zohar of someone who's throwing behind the shoulder, which means we may not want to have a relationship, but you can still get spiritual flow from somebody who does not want the relationship. And with the human being and God, King Solomon says, it's like, just like the heart of one person to his fellow, so too, just like the reflection you show to the water, so too is the heart of a human being toward his fellow. In other words, mystically speaking, that refers to God as well. Whatever I project to God, that's what I get back. So if I want to connect to God, then God wants to connect with me. If I don't want to connect to God, then he doesn't want to connect to me. So
but he still wants the Klippa to exist. That's why you're getting this.
Correct. Later on, we'll talk about it in chapter 22, that there's different levels of will. When I say he doesn't want is the tricky word. There's external will and internal will. External will means you want something for something else, right? I want the Klippa to exist, so there'll be free choice. That's external will. Internal will is the thing that I really want. That I don't want for any alternative additional purpose. It's not, this will is not serving a different will. Most of the wills we have is really serving other wills. I want to have money so I can pay my mortgage. I want to pay my mortgage so I can have a house. I want a house so I should not be cold, right? So all of our wills are layered, but essentially the more external the will is the will that serves a different will. The essential will is the will that serves, what do you really want? Okay, you need to have everything else has to work for you to get what you really want. But what do you really want? That's what we mean when we say God's will. And when he has an external will, like I say, I want to catch the train. Why do you want to catch the train? Because I want to get to Manhattan. I don't really want to go to Manhattan. I just need to get my paycheck, right? So you don't really want it. You just want it for something else. So in some sense, you're forced because this will, you don't want this, but you want this because you want something else. So in that sense, that's the doctrine of behind the shoulder.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Bob.
In the dichotomy between universalism and the particular, the chapter starts in a very universal way. It's like you're all the same, you're all God's children, God bless. And then as you get into the chapter, you kind of twist it into a particularism of there's a hierarchy, there's the brain, there's the toenail, cleave to the sage because they're better than you and you can get a taste of God. Am I missing something?
No, I think you're right. I think the reality is that I can say everybody's the same. And in some ways it's true. And in some ways it's not true. And I could say everybody is different. And in some ways it's true, and in some ways it's not true. And this is a very good point that you put your finger on. We're having it both ways. And that's the metaphor of the child. The metaphor of the child is we're having it both ways. On one hand, every part of the child is made up of the same DNA. On the other hand, there's gradations within the child. Now, I think that's what we're trying to do. And I think that's true in reality as well. In some sense, we're all the same. But if we're all the same, then we're redundant, right? It's not a if I say I'm exactly like you, so then you're dispensable and I'm dispensable, right? So there's a beautiful the Talmud says that a human being can make many coins, but every coin is stamped with the same stamp, right? How do you make a coin? You have a whatever they call it. You have a either a stamp or you have a mold, right? Every coin you make with the same mold. Here he says God creates every human being with their unique mold. So on one hand, we're all created in the image of God. On the other hand, none of us we each have a unique mold. We each are unique. And if I'm the same function as you, if I serve the same function as you do, then you don't need me, right? So you're right. There is and that's what that's the tension here, especially with the people who are into the spiritual texts, and they understand that there was differences within souls, and some souls are more spiritually oriented than others. And that was the premise. The premise is you have to luck out. You have to get a good soul. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, I don't care what's, so in other words, the second half of the chapter was what was commonly known to the Kabbalists. Everyone understood there's 4 worlds, and there's 3 levels of the soul, and every soul, you can have one of those 3 levels coming from one of these worlds. And there's so many, everybody was busy trying to figure out what type of soul do I have. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman, before he deals with the particular, he says, look, let me just explain to you. Every soul is the same. Every soul emerges from the divine mind. It's like the seed of the father giving birth to a child. We're all the same DNA. Essentially, we're all the same. Yeah, but what about all the differences that we have? Okay, we'll deal with that. But despite those essential differences, we're all the same. So I think the short answer is, go ahead.
Is he then saying it takes a village, like that we all contribute to the divine good, or
sure.
is he pulling rank and saying because I'm a rabbi and more spiritually enlightened, I'm better than you and will always be better?
No, it takes a village in the sense that just like with a human being, if you had a head and no feet, you can't accomplish anything. On the other hand, some people are better about action, and some people are better with ideas, right? So it's not about rank. It's not about rank on better. What's better, the foot or the head? What's greater, the foot or the head? Okay. Well, the answer is it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to solve a mathematical equation, the head is better than the foot. But if you're trying to cross the river, the foot is better than the head. Okay. So the foot is better. So the question, we cannot, the Jewish people, the collective souls cannot achieve the purpose of creation without every single soul. Now, is one soul better or worse? It depends. It depends what you mean by better. Are some souls more conscious of their source? Yes, that's the mind. Are some souls much better at action, at getting things done? Yes, right? Sometimes the person who's very conscious of their source is less able to go out there and be successful in the physical world and to, for example, do mitzvot. So within the Talmud, you see the division between people whose primary occupation, primary spiritual purpose is study of Torah, whereas there are others whose primary occupation is to do mitzvot. And sometimes the action people are not the scholars. Sometimes people have great ideas, but they can't get anything done, right? So you have the foot and you have the head. And now you can look at it as rank, or you can look at it as no, they're not. It's not a question of rank. It's a question of what needs to be done. And that's why, by the way, when he says our generations are the heels of Mashiach, Rabbi Shneur Zalman gets back to this in the 4th section of Tanya. The purpose of our generation is primarily action. The earlier generations, their spiritual purpose was more to be cognizant. And therefore, the study of Torah was their main spiritual purpose. For us, everybody, remember, every person has to have everything. So we each have every soul is an entire person, but all souls are one person. In other words, we each have a little bit of everything. So what I'm trying to say is now collectively, we're all feet. Even the sages in this generation are all feet. In other words, in some sense, in our generation, the most important thing is action. That may have been different in Moses' generation. So the point here is what we're trying to say is it's not a question of what's better or worse. It's a question of we're different. But if you want to talk about awareness, and there is a difference. The awareness of your divine source. Some souls are more aware. They're not more godly, but they're more aware of the godly soul. Is the brain's DNA closer to the father than the toenail's DNA? No. Essentially, they are the same. There's no difference between the two. But you want to talk about awareness? Are some souls more spiritually aware? The answer is unequivocally yes. And the more I connect to those souls who are spiritually aware, the more I become spiritually aware of my source, not of their source, of my source. The more I get in touch with my DNA. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, so we're having it both ways. On one hand, there's gradations within souls. But on the other hand, we're saying every soul has the same DNA. And if you want to be aware of your DNA, you better get in touch with somebody who's aware of their DNA. And then they'll teach you to be aware of your DNA.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Now we have one more problem, one more issue. And the issue is what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to do is now say there's no hierarchy. The way it used to be based on the Zohar, people thought that if you're a holy person, if you're a spiritual person, you'll have spiritual children. And if you're not spiritual, your children will be unspiritual because of something the Zohar says. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman clarifies it's not what the Zohar means. The Zohar says that the type of soul your child is going to have is relevant to the type of consciousness and awareness you had at the moment of the union. At the moment of the union of male and female. That affects the soul of your child. And therefore, if there are simple people who don't have the proper awareness, the implication is their children are not going to be spiritual. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says this has nothing to do with the core of the soul. The core of the soul is the opposite. Very often you have people who are ignoramus and unspiritual, and their children's souls derive from a very high place. Why that is another story. But what we're dealing here with a different concept called the levush, called the garment, which we'll hear about later in chapter 4. So I don't know if we'll fully explain it now, but I want to just make a dash for it so we finish in the next 5 minutes, we finish a chapter, but just to keep the picture of what's happening here. The notion was that someone who's not spiritual, someone who's more coarse, is going to have the same child. Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, no, the opposite. Sometimes the most loftiest souls come to be the children of people who are wicked. And for the examples, of course, are plenty, starting with Abraham himself, who was the child of a idol worshiper, and many of the Jewish sages were children of people who are ignorant, people who are even Gentiles, and some were descendants of people who are wicked. The bottom line is that mystically speaking, the type of parent you had has nothing to do with the type of soul you have. So again, if you want to talk about the question of is there a hierarchy or not, the last third of the chapter smashes all question of hierarchy, that I'm more spiritually sensitive because my parents were more spiritually sensitive. It doesn't work that way. There is a benefit to having parents who are spiritually sensitive, but that's about the garment. It's not about your core. We'll read as much as we can. We'll understand as much as we can, not promising to understand everything, but here we go. And so this sounds like a contradiction. As for what it is written in Zohar and Zohar Chadash, to the effect that the essential factor is to conduct oneself in a holy manner during sexual union, which is not the case with the children of the ignorant and so on. So in other words, there it implies that the children of people who are not spiritually sensitive are not going to have a spiritual soul. And that seems like different than what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying, that every soul is holy and spiritual. So let's see what he says. It is to be understood as meaning that since there is not a nefesh, ruach, and neshama, which has not a garment of the nefesh of its father and mother's essence, and all the commandments that it fulfills are all influenced by that garment, and even the benevolence that flows to one from heaven, all is given through that garment. Hence, through self-sanctification, one will cause to descend for the neshama of one's child a holy garment. And however great the soul is, it may be, it still needs the father's sanctification. Okay, well, there's a garment. Garment, I would say the best way to put it is some level of the personality is based on the parent's conduct. But listen to these words. These words are very powerful, and they were revolutionary at the time. But as for the soul itself, it sometimes happens that the soul of an infinitely lofty person comes to be the son of a despised and lowly man. All this has been explained by Rabbi Isaac Luria of blessed memory, the Arizal, and the Kodesh Torah and Parshas Vayikra, and Talmei HaMitzvos and Parshas Bereshis. Remember that he's a compiler. He's not a compiler, but he's based on previous sources, so he's quoting those sources. What have we just done? We said, look, certain aspects of your personality comes from your parents. That's clear. And therefore, there isn't a spiritual advantage to have parents who are spiritually sensitive. Wonderful, especially at the time of the union. Wonderful. But does that affect what soul you're going to have? No. First, so there's two. No, because the souls, sometimes a super lofty soul, essentially lofty soul comes to be the child of someone who's ignorant, and vice versa. What are we saying here? By the way, ignorant is not the right word. Ignorant doesn't mean someone who forgot to go to school. Ignorant is just the translation. It's not the perfect word. It means somebody who is not spiritually sensitive to be able to understand. Okay, what are we saying here? So we're saying two things that would explain this point. This last third is really going back to the first and saying, highlighting the idea that not only does every soul come from the essence of God, but also the type of soul you're going to get is not forced upon you by the parent's decision or the parent's state of mind and the parent's awareness. Rather, it's part of the divine plan of which soul you get, depending on what your mission in creation is. But the takeaway of all this, remember, there's three parts of the chapter. The first third is saying his big idea. The big idea is that every soul has a God. Every soul has a part of God that emerges from the divine mind, which means that it doesn't feel itself. All it wants is to connect to its source. That's the godly soul. The second chapter, we dealt with the issue, if all souls are the same, how are they so different? And the answer is, they're the same on the DNA level, the essential level, they're the same, but nevertheless, there could be differences, just like a child has differences, even though essentially made of the same DNA. And the third thing we're trying to figure out is who gets those lofty souls? Who gets the souls that are like the brain? Does it have to be does my father and mother have to be the brain for me to be a brain? The answer is no. The answer is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't really have to do, it's by the divine plan. It has nothing to do with what the parents do. Even though it is true that the parents' awareness does affect certain aspects of the personality. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, we start getting into it. What is a soul? And what is a soul? You said there's a godly soul and an animal soul. Okay, so what's a soul? So we're going to explain what a soul is, and we say a soul has two things. A soul has 10 attributes, 10 sfirot, and that he's going to address in chapter 3. And it also has garments, and those garments are in chapter 4. So once we understand what a soul is, soul has 10 faculties and 3 garments. Now we'll understand what the soul is. Now we'll understand what the soul wants and how it interacts with the person and how those souls interact with each other. And then the drama begins. But before we figure out, so that's what we're doing. So the outline is chapter 1 is the natural soul. Chapter 2 is the godly soul. And chapter 3 and 4 is describing what is a soul. What is a soul? What's its toolbox? What does it have? What does it do? What's its personality? So for that, you have to come back next week and the following week. So thank you for joining. I know we read through a lot and we're doing this quick, but I guess the next time around maybe we'll do it a little slower. When I came to Greenwich, the first thing we did is we studied on Sundays, we studied the Parsha. So in 1 year, we finished the entire Torah. Then people said, hey, it's too fast. We have to slow down. So we slowed down. And then it took us 12 years to finish the entire Torah. So maybe we'll finish the Tanya in 1 year because it's 53 chapters and about a year. And then the next time around, we can take it line by line. But we're still looking for the big ideas. And so I apologize for moving so quickly. But again, any comments, questions, you could send it by text, by email, by phone, any way you like. Not that I have guaranteed to give any answers, but certainly the discussion is great. So anyone could stay on for questions, but we already went way over time. So have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos. And you should have a lot of light in this world because it's the light of the Shabbos candles and the light of the Hanukkah candles. And remember, when you look at the light, you're really looking at a reflection of your soul because the candle is like the soul. What does it want? It wants to escape. But you're going to lose yourself. Doesn't matter. I'm not into myself to begin with. I'm going to my source. I'm going to lose my distinction. I'm connected to something, to my source, which is my core essence. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom. Thank you.